Throughout this video, we will take you through the life of a fictional character named Juma. By viewing life through the eyes of Juma, we will put on display the impact that Britain had on Kenya in the early 1930s.
A land clad in virgin verdure, with lofty palms of graceful waving fronds, green grass, and brilliant shrubbery, relieving the shimmering sheen of the sun-kissed sea, met the entranced gaze of Vasco da Gama and his fleetmates upon their entrance to Mombasa harbor on the 7th day of April in the year of our Lord 1498. Discovered by Europe in the year 1498, East Africa was a small portion of land located on the eastern African coastline, inhabited by natives. After 300 years of war between the Portuguese and Arabian armies to decide who would control the newly discovered land and people, the Portuguese took control. Shortly after, the British arrived along the coastline in 1823 and abruptly took over, forcing the African inhabitants into a small portion of land. Britain, while ruling over East Africa in 1893, merged their new area of land with Uganda and created the new British East Africa. This was soon to become the Kenyan colony. Over the next 100 years, the Eastern African Protectorate was implemented, which encouraged settlement in the Kenyan colony. More and more settlers arrived, but as the loosely British-controlled African governments began to fail, Britain became more and more involved with the everyday life in their Kenyan colony. Once Britain became more involved, they began to attempt to improve the educational system throughout their new colony. They did this by implementing new policies that challenged the African beliefs, which caused unrest with the African people. These new policies challenged the traditional way of living throughout the colony and changed the everyday life of an average Kenyan. One major aspect that was affected throughout the colony of Kenya was their trade. Britain sent trade advisors to help, aid, and support the Kenyans. These advisors instructed the Kenyans on the proper forms of trade and revamped their traditional ways. This also caused unrest with the Kenyan natives. Although Kenyan natives were against the surge of British occupants, these occupants increased the population in the colony and helped the colony's economy. The economy did better overall, but was structured mainly in favor of the new white settlers and not the traditional Kenyan natives. Part of the reason that the economy was set to improve the life of the new white settlers was due to the fact that only British men could be a part of the government. They would implement laws that helped the white men and negatively affected the colored African natives. For example, laws were implemented that forced native African laborers to work on white men's farms for no pay. This caused much unrest and rebellion throughout the colony.
Juma is a middle-aged man who has spent his whole life in Kenya. Having grown up in the early 1900s in Kenya, Juma has witnessed the changes that have taken place over time in the educational system, the government structure, and the economy. Juma's typical morning starts with him getting his children ready for school. As he does this, he reflects on how the schooling that his children receive is so much more advanced than what he experienced growing up.
Juma was forced to drop out of school in 1915 when the British government improved the schooling systems but forced families to pay. Juma's family could not afford to educate their son, so he was forced to drop out. Juma's mother and father decided it best for him to learn by experience rather than in a missionary school led by the British. The teachers in these missionary schools were appointed by the government and told what to teach the children. To attend the missionary school, Juma's parents had to pay a flat rate of 100 shillings per month for boarding, as well as tuition fees for 10 shillings per month. Juma's family could not afford to educate their son, so he was forced to drop out. When more and more native Kenyan children could not afford to go to school, a new type of school system was formed that was independent of the government. The African School Association was established and created a form of schooling that was decent education for free. With this having been created, Juma is able to send his children to receive the schooling that he could not.
Once Juma has gotten his kids ready for school, he is off to his job as a manual laborer.
With the British in charge, the trade expansion was flourishing and there was a need for a modern transportation system, which led Juma to a job building the railways in 1903. Now he works on the maintenance of this railway. He repairs parts of the track when they fail and is stationed at one of the stops in between Uganda and the Indian Ocean port of Mombasa in Kenya. The British government created this railway project in order to obtain an easier way to export goods out of different parts of Africa. Being stationed at this stop, Juma is able to see all the different things that are being traded in and out of Kenya, such as cotton textiles, which mainly come from Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, India, and the Netherlands. Other domestic trade goods were coffee, sisal, tea, gold, hides and skins, cotton, and maize. Another wide range of production includes butter, wheat, pyrethrum, timber, and essential oils.
Once Juma is at work, he discusses the current events with his coworkers. Most of his coworkers are quite unhappy with the new government system that the British have implemented. They all agree that the everyday native Kenyan was far better off before the British became more involved. As they talk, they discuss their displeasure with the new laws implemented that clearly favored the white man.
In 1923, the Devonshire Declaration was made, which proclaimed that all African activities should be placed above everyone else's. This was not the case because British colonial officials were the only people allowed in the government, and they created laws that gave the British all the power. The laws that were made only applied to the natives of Kenya. One law forced the Kenyans to become laborers that worked only on the British settlers' property. By 1930, the British had separated themselves from all of the natives with a law called the Township Ordinance. The Township Ordinance outlined boundaries throughout Kenya, creating a total of 77 townships. A township is a bordered area where people live and work as their own community. Even though the British were the smaller group of people, they made up the government, which gave them power above all the Kenyans. There was a rush of British immigrants who became rich in Kenya, and this boom in population created a spike in the economy, but this spike was mainly due to the fact that the British government forced Kenyan natives to work for them for little or no pay. This gross overwork and underpay allowed for British immigrants to flourish economically, while the Kenyans were doing all of the manual labor. Although the new laws and policies implemented by the British government created a growth in the Kenyan economy, it created an awful, unfair quality of life for Kenyan natives. After a long day of work on the railway, Juma heads home to his children and wife. On his journey home, he ponders life in Kenya under British rule. He thinks about his children's education, his way of making a living, the government that rules over him, and how he believes his fellow native Kenyans are being treated unfairly. He is happy that his children are receiving a better education than he did before them. Although he always has a job to go to, he is unhappy that he is forced to work for a little pay so that the lives of Britons can be made easier. He despises the government that rules over him and is upset that he cannot join and make a difference due to the fact that he is a native Kenyan. He thinks of everything that has come into effect since the new white settlers have taken control of his homeland. He weighs the price of his children becoming better educated, the price of him having a steady job, the price of his nation's economy growing over the past few years. The price that he and his fellow native Kenyans have to pay is their freedom, and that is a price he believes to be too high.